So my name's Frances Guy. I'm from Scotland's International Development Alliance, and we're very pleased and honoured to have our colleagues from IIED, International Institute for Environment and Development. Sorry, I had to write it down because I always get it wrong. I apologise. We always call you IIED, and we're very, very happy to have you here. I was privileged to hear a similar presentation in September, and I can assure you it is both fascinating, eye-opening, and hopefully inspiring for people who are working in this area, and that we will all take away something that we can do from the end of this, which is part of, I think, what we want to achieve. So I'm not going to prolong my little words anymore. I'm going to hand you over to James, who will talk about what Hidden Handbrakes is really about and introduce the team. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis, and yeah, welcome to everybody who is here. And if you're watching the recording, welcome to you too. Delighted to be being hosted by Scotland's International Development Alliance, and it's a privilege for us to have a chance to share this campaign opportunity with your members, Francis. So thanks for giving us the opportunity too. Delighted to be joined by some colleagues from IIED who I will let introduce themselves when they come to talk about their areas. My name is James Persad, and I'm the Communications Director at IIED, and have been in post for about 2.5 years now. And when I joined at the same time as our new Executive Director, Tom Mitchell, and we had shared idea that there were many blockers to progress, swifter progress on climate justice and social justice around the world that would benefit from greater scrutiny from different audiences. And certainly in the areas of work that we had both worked on independently, it seemed that there are a large number of these blockers to more rapid progress, which was getting in the way of the sort of thriving world that we want to see and enjoy. To that end, we made an approach to a foundation called the Generation Foundation, who very kindly granted us £750,000 for 3 years of work to do research that helps to surface some of these blockers into the public arena, particularly through press and media, but also through other channels, our website, our newsletter, and our social media feeds, and importantly through partner channels too. So I guess my kind of overarching pitch here is that there is funding available to research organizations, journalists, other advocates, other interested parties, for people who are doing research into what we could consider to be described as a hidden handbrake on climate and social justice. The key KPI for me and the team is that handbrake can be converted into a news story, which is why I'm very pleased to have John Sharman on the call, who's in our press team from IIED, who with colleagues have an acute sense of what it takes to get into the news, having been news journalists themselves for many years, in John's case at the Independent newspaper, amongst others. So what I'm going to do is allow colleagues to introduce themselves and their areas of work. But first, I just wanted to sort of talk about, broadly speaking, some of the work that we've done during the course of this campaign. So first off, we have identified a longish list of handbrakes, and those span from, for example, investor-state dispute settlements, so a sort of tribunal court that rules for or against organizations and governments where organizations, particularly the fossil fuel industry, have entered into binding contracts with governments about the investments being made in fossil fuels, and where those governments want to transition to renewable fuels, they are effectively held over a barrel by the fossil fuel companies that threaten legal action. That's through the ISDS system. We have done work on critical minerals and the land rights that are not afforded to those citizens who have been stewarding that land for generations. When mining companies and corporate interests come in to try and extract those minerals. We have done some really successful work on hot cities. So the fact that people in informal settlements are often marginalized from the decision-making processes that help to make those cities more livable and better for all citizens and not just the privileged few, and other work around debt and climate finance, which May and Paul may speak to around how the fact that many countries receive less in climate finance than they have to make in debt interest repayments to wealthy countries. So that's just a few examples, and we'll go into each in more detail as we go through the panel. We're going to then have some time for Q&A after the panelists have presented. And I think at the moment we won't move into breakout rooms for discussion. We'll just have a discussion in this room. And then Francis and I will wrap up at the end. So hopefully about an hour and a half for the full event. Okay. Please do introduce yourselves if you haven't in the chat, and please do put questions in there as well to help feed the Q&A for later. But in the meantime, May to introduce the first hidden handbrake around climate finance. Over to you, May. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, James. And thank you, everyone, for having me here. My name is May, and I am a researcher at IIED working on promoting locally led adaptation and our advocacy agenda around getting finance to the most local level. So, stepping back a bit, what is locally led adaptation? Locally led adaptation we have a set of principles around what locally led adaptation should be that are very much centered around climate justice, which I notice that a lot of you are working on. The principles recognize that the most climate affected communities are not getting the resources or have the power to action climate action, and that the climate finance architecture, the system in which climate finance is channeled to local communities, is broken. And so these principles are a set of 8 principles, which were collaboratively developed by a whole range of actors, including grassroots organizations, women's groups, intermediaries like IIED ourselves, and donors who really felt that local communities should be front and center of climate action. And the principles are a set of principles that recognize different ways in which local communities can be recognized. So I can pop that in the chat, the principles that we have later. So the hidden handbrake that I will talk about is about adaptation finance and how it's failing those at the most local level that are most impacted by climate change. And so the LLA principles frame some of our conversations around that. They recognize that local communities don't have the power to access the resources, that the system is very onerous and cumbersome, and impossible for very local actors to access funding from the system. And yeah, so I'll talk about the hidden handbrake itself. So adaptation finance is failing the most vulnerable people, and it consistently fails to get financing compared to mitigation. So mitigation gets a lot of attention, a lot of funding, over 90% in climate funding, and adaptation consistently is trickling. And when it comes to the local level, there's even smaller amounts that goes to the most impacted climate vulnerable communities. When we talk about climate finance, we talk about both the quality and the quantity of climate finance, which I can explain to you a little bit more about. What gets press coverage a lot, and which you'll probably hear about the most, is the quantity of finance, the numbers, how much is going where, who is giving how much is going to the local level. But our advocacy agenda is around, yes, the quantity is important, but the quality is also important. How people are receiving it in the forms of grants or loans, which Paul will talk about later. Is it easy to access? Is it actually changing people's lives and addressing the needs around adaptation? Those are more of the qualitative aspects that we talk about. So the hidden handbrake is very much about the fact that adaptation is falling behind mitigation, and that both the quality and the quantity need to be improved in order to enable effective locally led adaptation. I can talk a little bit about the quantity figures as well. So in 2021 to 2022, a CPI report found that mitigation received 91% of climate funding. And so tiny amounts went to adaptation. And within this figure, only 1.5% of total climate finance went to adaptation specific activities. When you take that 1.5 figure and try to delve into how much is actually going to local communities, how much is going to Indigenous peoples organizations, other marginalized groups, SIDS, LDC, some of the most climate impacted communities, it's very, very opaque. And IIED's research from 2017 has found that maybe about 10% goes to the local level. But when you disaggregate it further to look at how much goes to IPs, Indigenous peoples organizations, women's groups, you'll see that it's very hard to understand how much is going where, and also that the numbers are very, very small. So that is a hidden handbrake that we ask you to really delve into on the quantity aspect. How much is going where, to whom, and how do we make this a more transparent system of accountability?
Thank you, May. That's terrific. Sorry, were you going to continue there, May?
I was. Do I have any time left?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay. And then the next issue is around the quality of finance, which I mentioned a bit as well. A lot of the money, the very small amounts going to adaptation, is channeled through expensive intermediaries. UN agencies, for example, receive massive amounts of the funding from the Green Climate Fund, and the money is channeled through them. And not so there's several layers of intermediaries before money gets to the local level. How can we change the system so that it's more a direct way that communities can receive money? There's also lots of onerous procedural barriers. So application processes are onerous, reporting processes are onerous, and these need to be streamlined in order for very local grassroots organizations to get the money, the climate finance that they need. And like I mentioned before, transparency is very poor. So I'll just skip to the end. What can you do as part of the Hidden Handbrakes campaign? So as I mentioned before, on the quantity of finance, we need greater transparency. There's lots of different ways of reporting climate finance, but overall, in general, it's very opaque how much money is going to whom. We'd also like to know, we'd also like to have better procedures around the quality of finance. So if there could be good practices that you're interested in finding out, how is it that institutions are improving their bureaucracy so that fund money can go to the local level? That's also an area of work that we'd really like a spotlight on. And we'd also like evidence of why locally led adaptation and locally led climate action matters. And for those of you working with grassroots communities, local organizations, you have that evidence. We need to demonstrate to funders why we need to change the broken system that it is. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, May. Super clear. And If you do have any questions about the work that May is leading on, please do put them into the chat to stimulate the Q&A session later. Okay, handing over next to Paul Steele, Chief Economist. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk about the hidden handbrake related to debt, and I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Hopefully, I'm going to talk about 3 challenges and 3 potential solutions. So the 3 challenges is, first of all, debt is huge. Many developing countries are actually now paying more in interest payments than they are spending on health and education. So leave aside money for climate justice, they can't even afford basic healthcare and basic education. So that's the first challenge. Second challenge is the debt creditor profile is very complicated, particularly compared to what it was a decade or so ago. In a decade or so ago, you may remember there was this big campaign, or more like 20 years ago, there was this big campaign to forgive debt when a number of Western nations who were the main creditors forgave the debt, particularly in Africa, under the so-called high indebted poor country initiative. Nowadays, the debt is less owed to Western countries, partly because a lot of debt was forgiven under the previous campaign, but it's now owed to the private sector. So many private banks, the big private asset managers like BlackRock and HSBC, own debt in developing countries. Secondly, a lot of debt is owed to China. I'm sure you're aware that China is the main creditor to many countries in Africa. You'll have heard about these big infrastructure projects which are built in African countries, which have led to these indebted debts to China. And thirdly, there's a lot of debt owed to multilaterals, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, who did a lot of lending post pandemic to help countries, but it's led to a lot of debt. So that's the second challenge, that debt is quite complex and there's a whole array of different creditors. And what that means is working out how to forgive and manage debt is a much more complicated process than it used to be. The third challenge is that this is, in many cases, an unknown issue when it comes to climate finance. I mean, May was talking about climate finance, but many people, when they talk about climate finance, just think about international flows. They don't think about the link between debt and climate, and the fact that countries can't spend on climate mitigation and adaptation, as May was saying, because they're so indebted. They don't have what economists call the fiscal space, or the ability to spend their way on these important climate priorities, because they're literally just paying too much money to China or the private sector or to multilaterals in terms of interest payments. So that's the third challenge. So turning now to the potential solutions. So what can you do as CEDA members, if you like? The first one is public pressure. I noticed that someone on the call is from Christian Aid. As you'll be aware, the Pope is leading what's called a Jubilee campaign in this year, 2025, to encourage the forgiveness of debts in developing countries. So that's an example of the kind of public pressure that can be brought to bear, and was very instrumental in the debt forgiveness campaign 20 years ago, when youth and musicians and so on, pop stars, were mobilized around Live Aid and other campaigns to forgive debt in Africa and so on. The second thing is to have political champions. With the change of government in the UK, there's an improved environment for forgiving debt. And in fact, the Labour government has made debt forgiveness and debt issues one of their priorities for countries in the developing world. So helping identify political champions, whether they're in Scotland or in Westminster, is important, and supporting those political champions with campaigning and advocacy. And thirdly, helping to put pressure and try and change the minds of creditors who own the debt, because if they're not willing to change their mind, there's very little that can be done. So China does seem to be a bit more sympathetic to debt forgiveness. It kind of often gives debt deals behind closed doors, but there's pressure. Pressure can be brought to bear to make those deals a bit more transparent, so they're in the public eye rather than behind closed doors. Private creditors can be pressurized to have regulations to force them to forgive debt, because many of the private companies that own the debt are located in the UK, and then some of the multilaterals, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank, the UK has a seat on their board. So again, the UK can advocate for debt forgiveness by those institutions. So those are the three potential solutions: public pressure, political champions, and creditor pressure, and to bring a creditor willingness to forgive. So I'll stop there and hand back to James. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Super interesting as always, and yeah, great to hear your takes on the solutions too. Fine. Next up, handing over to Ritu Bharadwaj, please. Over to you, Ritu.
Thanks, James. And I hope my slides are visible. And apologies in advance that I'm using a couple of slides here.
No problem.
Because
we can see them, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm just going to turn on my own timer, James, here, so I know I am keeping on time. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ritu Bharadwaj, and I direct a portfolio of work which looks into climate resilience, finance, and loss and damage. And what I'm going to be talking about the subjectivity that is there in the way credit rating, sovereign credit rating particularly, is being carried out, and how that penalizes both the least developed countries and small island states. So the moment you talk about credit rating, many people think that this is a subject which is, not everybody's piece of cake. So I just thought of putting something in perspective so you understand, people who are not very aware about this. So firstly, credit rating is dominated by three entities: Moody's, Standard & Poor, and Fitch. In many sense, it's called oligopoly because they dominate 95% of the market share. It is more than 100 years old industry. Still, they have not allowed any other entity to enter into this space. Now, these are typically the four areas that they typically assess to look into assessing the credit rating of the countries. The weightages assigned might be slightly here and there, but by and large, these are the indicators that they use. Now, I'm just going to quickly skip through some of these indicators that they are used for assessing the credit rating and how these indicators get negatively impacted because of climatic impact. So firstly, susceptibility to risk. Just look at the way the frequency of climatic events have increased in SIDS, more than 300% in the last 2 decades itself. Similarly, disaster intensities have increased. And when these intensity and frequency increases, then the impact that it has on countries' economy is devastating. SIDS, small island states, together account for 2/3 of the countries which suffer the highest average annual losses because of the disaster impact. So what does it do? So this is the second parameter, a set of parameters that credit rating entities assess. So every time a country is hit by a disaster, they suffer economic losses, but they have to borrow more on top of their previous debt just to tide over that crisis, provide relief, rescue, rehabilitation support to the communities. And every time so you can see the red lines are when the countries are hit by disaster intensity more than 1. And after every disaster, their debt levels go up. Similarly, in the case of Belize or in the case of Fiji, we have data for almost all the SIDS on a similar pattern. But as a result, what you can see is more than 70% of the SIDS had their debt sustainability threshold breached, and almost 6 states had their debt to GDP ratio beyond 100%, which is, their debt is far beyond the existing GDP. Then again, some of the parameters that debt sustainability assessment typically uses, for example, the external debt of SIDS have increased from 45% to 58% from low disaster intensity period to high disaster intensity period. Similarly, fiscal balance, which is a good indicator of countries' fiscal health, so it can be surplus of or deficit, and that increases from minus 2.8 to minus 4.5%. from low disaster to high disaster intensity period. And then again, tax revenue volatility, which is how, because every time a disaster strikes, the economy comes to a standstill and there is volatility in their tax collection. Similarly, the private sector debt has again gone up from 6.5 to 35% from low disaster to high disaster intensity period. So, what you can, why I presented that was to show that it is not because of poor economic policy, poor fiscal management, that the credit rating of these countries are going down. It is because of all the parameters that are typically used, and all of them get impacted because of climatic risk. So the red line that you see here is that of SIDS, small island states, so how their credit rating have gone down compared to those of developed country and developing country, which has almost remained static. So for SIDS, it's almost 3 percentage point decrease. And the blue line indicates the years when they were hit by disaster. So every time they're hit by disaster, their credit rating goes down. And so we also try to understand what the credit rating of these countries would have been had they not been hit by disaster. So we use something called synthetic control method, SCM, to discount the impact of disasters. And you can see the orange dotted line is where the credit rating of these countries would have been, which in this case is Papua New Guinea, similarly in the case of Belize, and then Grenada. Now, apart from this, you also have to understand that only 13 out of 39 SIDS actually have credit rating, which means this is because it comes at a very high cost, substantive administrative effort is required. Then many of the developed countries, they always hire an investor relationship management agencies, which comes at a very high cost. And as a result, SIDS and LDCs fail to do that. And they also fail to communicate their credit stories effectively. Now, there could be solutions. For example, one of the works that we are doing with small island states is to set up something called SIDS Debt Sustainability Support Service. It's a holistic measure, and we are really enthused that the Finance for Development Conference, which is running different TREPCOM meetings, within their outcome document, they have considered SIDS Debt Sustainability Support Service as something which can really help addressing the debt issue as well as the credit rating issues of the LDCs, of the SIDS, and they're now considering expanding that to other least developed countries and other vulnerable countries like FCAS. So we have a couple of other solutions as well, but I'm going to stop there. And back to you, James. And I'm just going to pop in 2 papers in the chat box here so that in case you're interested in understanding what solution might look like, you can always refer to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ritu. Really fascinating and cutting edge work. Thanks for your time today. Yeah, I think it's incredible that some countries that are most vulnerable to climate change are sort of locked out of the process of even getting a credit rating in order to borrow at a more favorable rate because they don't have access or the capacity or the capability to get a rating in the first place. Okay, moving on to John, please talk about some of our media successes on Hidden Handbrakes. Thank you, John.
Thanks, boss. Hi, everyone. I'm John. I'm the press officer. I'm going to be talking to you about hot cities. Cities are hot, they're getting hotter. IIED has for a long time done work on improving urban areas to benefit people with the least resources there. It's one of our big themes. So we want to talk about it a lot, but the detail could be difficult to sell to a journalist because it's a sort of niche within a niche. So some time ago, we wanted to do it under the Hidden Handbrakes banner, and there were certain things we wanted to talk about. We wanted to talk about the impacts of climate change in slums and the impacts it can have on people and on economies. For if people can't work because it's too hot, that's obviously a bad thing. On health, and we wanted to talk about the potential solutions, like getting more, like May talked about, getting more quality climate finance to cities and having local people decide how they spend that money to best benefit them, and how often heat specifically can affect poorest people more. Basically, if you can afford an air conditioning unit, then you're probably fine. But the guy down the road who can't is not only dealing with the heat, but he's also dealing with the heat chucked out by somebody else's air conditioner. So we needed to make all of that quite complicated stuff accessible. So we put our heads together and we thought of a little sort of planned campaign of work that could come up with some big stats. Basically, journalists love stats; they're easy to build a story around. And then once you've got your foot in that door, you can talk about the complicated stuff. So we came up with how much hotter now are the world's biggest capital cities than they were 30 years ago. And we got that data. The answer is somewhere between a bit and quite a bit, depending on where you are. And that piece of research in sort of early summer, Northern Hemisphere summer last year, did very well. That went. We did some breakout stats for London, and that was picked up by the UK's biggest news agency, so it ran basically everywhere. We did Seoul in South Korea and a few others, and that once we were able to talk about the headline figures, we could then add in with quotes from our researchers some of our key messages around inequality, health, and the solutions. There was a big sort of audience that we couldn't reach with that work, which was the United States, world's biggest oil producer and consumer of stuff, because Washington, D.C. wasn't big enough to make the list. So what we did was work with CNN directly to find out similar statistics for the biggest cities in the States. And they ran that exclusively on their front pages of their website and TV and stuff. And it was also syndicated out to all the local TV stations that work with CNN. And that ended up with follow-up interviews as well. And we were able to get the message out about all the same things. It's a new story, but we're talking about the same things of inequality and health and the economic benefits of improving places where people live. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to take the last minute to shoehorn in another piece of work, which, Nina, I read your introductory message in the chat, might be relevant to your interests. We also have been, another thing that IIED works on is food systems. And as part of Hidden Handbrakes, we've identified harmful subsidies as a sort of a major handbrake to work on. So we've done some work around how food subsidies influence diets and health at the same time as causing climate change issues. So if you're subsidizing corn or soy and you're chopping down forests or covering up grasslands, you're destroying carbon sinks to produce animal feed or high fructose corn syrup. Or whatever these ultra processed ingredients might be. And I will put links to these things in the chat. And stop talking now. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, John. Great presentation. And yeah, John and colleagues have done a fantastic job to surface a lot of these issues into international press and media. And I think at the last count, we've had over 2,600 mentions of IIED and partner work in these different spaces over the 2 years. So it's done really well, and the fund is absolutely delighted that we are exposing some of these issues which are sort of little known or little understood to greater scrutiny. And I think we are starting to see some of the impacts of that. So some of the concepts that we're highlighting are being picked up by actors around the world and talked about by actors around the world, which is exactly the sort of influence that we want to see. Finally, I have got the sort of unenviable task of stepping in for Professor Lorenzo Catula, who is the expert on investor-state dispute settlements. Lorenzo is currently in another event, apologies, on critical minerals, on another channel. And forgive me because I can only talk in plain English, and it will come across super simple the way I put it. But essentially, our work is thus. So we need to move away from fossil fuels, and we need to move towards renewable fuels. But because of the dominance, I guess, and hegemony of the fossil fuel industry over decades, structures and constructs have sprung up that have helped to hold the fossil fuel sort of status quo in place. One of those structures are treaties, energy treaties that are struck between fossil fuel companies and national governments in order to essentially protect the fossil fuel companies' interests in that country. So a big example of this is the Energy Charter Treaty for Europe, or for the EU, I think. There are over 2,000 of these treaties across the world. Most of the countries in the world have one and are locked into them. Now, the challenge here is that with the drive to move to renewable fuels, fossil fuel companies through the sort of legalese of these treaties are able to sue the government for breach of the terms of the agreement that's been made. And the challenge there is that these treaties contain, I think they're called sunset clauses. So not only does the government have to use taxpayers' money to buy their way out of the contract, if you like, they also have to pay back future profits up to 20 years to the fossil fuel company itself, which strikes us and me as extraordinarily unfair. Our research showed that over $80 billion of taxpayers' money had gone back to fossil fuel companies through the ISDS process, the investor state disputes settlement process. And those courts where those decisions are made are very opaque. It's not particularly clear who the members are, who the decision makers are, how those decisions are reached, but nonetheless, we feel like they're favouring the fossil fuel industry. So what we have been trying to do is surface into the news the fact that these courts exist, the amount of money that's at stake, and the fact that it is hugely unfair on governments that are trying to move towards a renewable energy policy and infrastructure, and they're effectively held over a barrel by the fossil fuel companies. So what we are looking for as an institute is reform of these treaties. You may have seen in the news recently that a number of European countries have left the Energy Charter Treaty, including most recently the UK. But I think there are still over 20 countries locked in. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are over 2,000 of these treaties across the world currently benefiting fossil fuel companies and holding in place the extraordinarily damaging status quo that the fossil fuel companies have over the planet. So if any of you are doing work in this space or related spaces, please do let us know. And we'd love to talk to you more about whether there's the potential to do some work that might elicit more media coverage, or in any of the spaces that you've heard from the panel today. Okay. Thank you so much to the panel. We're going to move into the Q&A section now, and I don't know if people are willing or able to turn their cameras on so that we can see you and get to know you. If not, that's fine. If you do have any questions, please do put your hand up or put them in the chat. I've seen one from Francis, I think, for Ritu to get us going. So please do have a think about any questions for the team and how you can potentially access this funding, and we would be delighted to answer. But for now, Francis, I'll just speak to your question, if I may. So Mia Motley is very articulate on the downward spiral of climate disasters and the effects on credit and the inability to pay, even to support your country to get out of a disaster. Could you say anything about ideas to suspend debt when a climate disaster hit? Is that just a diversion, or would it be helpful? Thank you, Francis, for your question. Over to you, Ritu.
Thank you, Francis, for even raising that. In fact, that was on one of my slides. So there are four-pronged recommendations that we've given. One is, you must have seen from my slides that the way in which the existing assessment of credit worthiness, if I can say, is done, is basically flawed. It means, and as a result, what happens is the countries which are richer, or the developed countries, are the ones which get the capital for investment and development and growth at the cheapest cost compared to the countries which are poorer. They get the capital at the highest cost. So what needs to change? Firstly, of course, the issue about debt suspension. So as you could see from the slide, that every time a country is hit by disaster, their debt levels keep going up, which means that the debt levels are going up not because they're not managing their resources properly, and that's why they have to keep borrowing more and more money. So what we are saying is that when a country takes a debt relief, for example, undertakes a debt swap or debt restructuring, the moment a country does that, the credit rating entities immediately downgrade them without even assessing that, like whether that has had a negative or a positive impact. Now, in fact, if you ask us, the moment a country undertakes the debt restructuring because of climatic impact, that's a proactive step by the country to try to manage a situation that can have a negative impact. So what we are saying is countries, and there are several examples where it has happened. In fact, one of the slides where you could see that Grenada's credit rating immediately dropped, that was because it had undertaken a debt restructuring because of climatic impact. So that is number one. Number two, what we are saying is that the credit rating entities look at the risks of investment. Like, you are somebody with a pot of money, you want to go and invest in a country, they'll tell you, you should invest here, you should not invest here because your money could be risky here. You may not get it back. Whereas what we are wanting to say is assess the risk, absolutely needed, but also assess the opportunities for investment. For example, the entire Caribbean countries have a renewable energy potential of 30,000 megawatt. If you look at Pacific Islands, they have an annual fish production value of $5 billion annually. And similarly, if you look at many of the least developed countries or SIDS, the human capital that they have, like that educated, low-cost, skilled manpower they have, is far more compared to many developed countries. So for an investor who wants to go and invest in renewable energy, their investment in Caribbean countries would give them far better return on investment compared to that in UK, Germany, Spain, or any other country. So what we are saying is do a more holistic assessment of both risk as well as opportunities for investment. And the third, what we are saying, that even on the risk side, they should take a more multi-dimensional vulnerability assessment. And where, of course, I'm not going to take you through all of that. James would have other questions there to consider as well. But within the MVI, what we really want is for if a country has proactively gone and set up disaster risk management systems, they are not given brownie points for that. In fact, they are not given any points for that. So what we want this approach to change, where countries which are proactively trying to implement or put in place a good disaster risk management approaches, they should get a better value for their risks as well as return on investment. So there are a couple of some of these, but we also, like, the fourth issue is around where only 13 out of 39 SIDS have a credit rating. We need to have a more tiered approach to pricing of credit rating industry and so on. So, of course, it needs a holistic approach, but yes, some of these measures are there, and we are very happy that the current discussions that are happening at FFD, Finance for Development, they have actively considered all our suggestions. In fact, if you look at the outcome document, it integrates DSSS, the Debt Sustainability Support Service, as well as the credit rating reforms that we have suggested. So we are quite enthused about that. This is just the zero draft, but we do hope that in the road to Saville, much of it still remains there in the outcome document.
Thank you, Ritu. Francis, I hope that answers your question and more. And Ritu's being very modest. Ritu is central to the support to the SIDS, and I'm sure has got the presidents of most of the countries on speed dial for various questions that come up as we head towards the conference FFD4. Thank you, Ritu. Are there any questions from guests? Now, I can't see any hands up. Olga, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Hello. My question is too long to put in the chat because it's not. I don't know if it's really a question. It's about unlocking climate finance from companies, from private businesses, and how can we do that better? We had a storm Eowyn here in Scotland, and it caused so much damage. And now the Royal Botanic Gardens, for example, launched an appeal asking for help. And I don't know, I'm just a fan. I don't actually work with them. I don't know how many businesses will engage with that, but I can see that as a really good opportunity for them to donate and then get a lot of credit for that as a response to a disaster. But of course, we want to be much more, when we talk about, I don't want to talk about mitigation, but in terms of adaptation, to be much more proactive and not wait for a terrible disaster to happen to give money towards adaptation. And I was just wondering if you have in the panel and other guests have any tips for how to motivate that sort of engagement. I mean, we don't really have normal days anymore, but before disasters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great question, Olga. I'm wondering from the IIED team and others who would like to take this question. Paul, Ritu, May.
I can have a stab. We work mostly with public finance and money from government, so have not been able to unlock the money from the private sector. There are a couple of companies that are looking at innovative insurance and trying to work in the insurance related around climate related disasters and trying to integrate risks into decisions around how insurance is assessed. That might be an option. But I think in order to really engage the private sector, there needs to be more government subsidies, both carrots and sticks. And so one of the things that should be done, for example, is getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, which can unlock a lot of money to go into adaptation finance. So these kinds of necessary levers are needed in order to get the private sector engaged, because especially with adaptation finance, because there is no a return on investment, like investing in mitigation and trying to get returns on solar farm, wind farms, etc. It's very hard to get the private sector to be more engaged in adaptation finance, because they don't see a return on investment and they see it as being too much of a risk to their portfolio.
Thank you, May. That's a great answer. Ritu, I can see you've got your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, very quickly, James. One, to build on what May said, and also to respond to some of the questions that have come up in the chat very quickly. So one is, see, of course, private sector, there's a huge pressure on private sector as well. And, ESG is something which is creating pressure. Of course, I don't know what would happen after Trump's regime, but if you look at all the listing all the listing of the companies on the share market, are contingent upon them to transparently to explain how they have invested their money in the ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And earlier, companies could get away by any kind of investment, but now it is increasingly put under scrutiny by the board of many of these companies itself, focusing on both the environmental side as well as the social and the governance side. So it is not like the private sector is not under pressure. Private sector is under pressure. They cannot, when I say listing, the listing on the share market. So that is one. Second is, I saw a couple of questions in the chat talking about what would happen to reduce or cancel the debt, and so on and so forth. See, of course, we know that reducing or canceling, especially canceling debt, is not a viable option forward. We can, in case of extreme climatic impact, look at canceling some of the debt. And in fact, there is a pause clause, something called pause clause, contingency clause, which is much in discussion recently. But the point is, we need to find a more sustainable solution to that. And some of the solutions that have come forward, and even we have ourselves written a paper about, is parametric insurance of sovereign debt. So to ensure the GDP losses or the debt of the country, so the moment a country is losing more than 20, 50, or 100% of their GDP because of climatic losses, then the insurance kicks in and covers for those losses. So the countries would not have to suffer the losses that only because of the climatic change. Now, we have also calculated the premium that it would cost in order to cover these GDP losses. And it's quite reasonable. When I say reasonable, it comes to around 500 million. Now, compare that to the amount of losses that countries suffer every time one country alone is hit by a cyclone or a hurricane or a disaster. That is nothing compared to that. And in fact, that is our assessment. We are not insurance experts. But there's another insurance company, Howden Group, many of you might know. They did a similar assessment only for V20 countries, and their premium cost came very close to what we had assessed. So that gives us a lot of hope that this is something which is viable and can be done. We don't need to ask many of these countries to go out with a begging bowl, especially during in the Trump era, where everything is whether I'm going to give you, I'm not going to give it to you. So there has to be a more worldly order around this. So when countries suffer these losses for no fault of theirs, they immediately insurance kicks in and covers for those losses. So these are some of the suggestions that we have suggested and actively being considered under FFD, and we are happy that many developed countries are supporting that too.
Thank you, Ritu. And Nina and Kelly, I hope that goes some way to answering your questions that you've put into the chat. Just to bring in Paul, if I may, for a minute, because IIED is developing some novel approaches to tackling debt through debt swaps. Paul, I wondered if you wouldn't mind talking to that topic briefly, just to help us all understand what they look like and what they can do.
Yeah, excuse me. I mean, along with the ideas that Ritu has suggested as solutions of parametric insurance and pause clauses, we've been looking, as you said, James, at what's called debt swap for climate and nature. So the debt is in some way repackaged or in some cases reduced, but as Ritu says, that's quite challenging to do. But in some way, it's the terms of the debt are improved, and the money that's saved is that the terms are improved by the creditor on condition that the debtor country invests these savings in climate and nature investments. They could be investments identified by the nationally determined contribution in the case of climate change, or the national strategy and action plan in the case of nature. And there are a number of countries which are doing this. We worked with Cape Verde in Africa, a small group of islands in Africa, that is doing that kind of instrument. And there's an American NGO which has been working with a lot of countries in the Caribbean and Latin America to do these so-called debt swaps. And they started off relatively small, but now the most recent ones are up to $1 billion. So they're increasingly growing and are providing novel sources of climate finance, bridging this gap and making the links, as I said, between climate and debt, which has so far been somewhat overlooked by both the debt community and the climate community.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for explaining the debt swap concept to us. Are there any other questions in the audience? I can't see any, but I may have missed one. Go ahead, Francis. Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't know if I count as the audience, but on the hot cities, I wondered so what we discussed, so I used to work as a gender advisor in UNDP, and what we discovered when we argued about taking a feminist economic approach to managing cities, what actually swayed the argument was to prove that it was economically beneficial to everybody to take a more feminist approach to how you manage things. And I just wondered if there's some economic arguments about investing in cooling cities. Logically, it would seem that there ought to be, but I'm just wondering if you have any of those figures so that we might all use them a little bit for campaigning purposes.
Sure, thank you. I could speak to that. I will find the link to the paper, but IIED's urban team did a joint report with Habitat for Humanity, looking at the economic benefits of upgrading informal settlements, and found that there is a potential, very significant GDP boost for the whole of society through doing that, which, I mean, it makes sense. People who are less stressed about having to, or who can sleep properly at night, all that sort of stuff. And on the feminist point, I mean, it's quite right that the impacts of heat and inequality in cities aren't always felt equally, and indeed, health, in particular, health for pregnant people is one of our top messages for our hot cities work, because the World Health Organization says that sustained extreme heat can be very dangerous during that time. I will now look out the paper I mentioned.
Thank you, John, and thanks for the question, Francis. I hope that goes some way to giving you a response. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, just to add to what John was saying, I mean, other economic costs are things like lost productivity. I mean, particularly if you have factories located in urban areas like garment factories. I think it's been shown that in Cambodia, for example, the workers, their productivity goes down substantially when it's too hot to work, and they get sick, as John was indicating. Then there's also the cost of air conditioning. Obviously, the demand for air conditioning goes up, which is a private cost, but it also has kind of impacts on the overall budget if the demand for diesel and imported fuel goes up as a result of increased electricity demand because of the air conditioning. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Just again asking for any hands up before I go to a question in the chat. And also, it would be great to hear about some of the areas of work that attendees are working in case it sparks ideas in our team. So please do share that if you wish to. There's a question from Patrick about what are the key moments coming up in the year where hidden handbrakes could potentially be focused on and released? Can I give that one to Oliver in the IIED team, please? What's coming up this year? Kind of key moments, conferences, events that we're focusing on.
Yeah, it's quite a big year for key moments and events for some of these particular handbrakes. So, I mean, kicking off pretty soon, we've got the second part of the biodiversity COP, and part of that's going to be really focused on the financing and resourcing for biodiversity restoration and what the sort of number will be that we'll get. So that links very much to, you know, how much money is actually getting to local communities as well, who are most impacted by that degradation. There's also going to be let me find where this is. There's also the Financing for Sustainable Development conference coming up, which again is going to be looking at sort of reform of the international financial architecture as well, which links into some of the debt work that we've been talking about here and the climate finance. Alongside that, there's also a number of PrepCon meetings in advance for it. There's also the climate weeks that happen in London and New York, which often brings together some of the traditional sort of funders that we talk about, but also we've talked quite a bit today about, you know, the role of the private sector and the role of private creditors to countries. And often they're in attendance at those city-based climate weeks as well. So we'll be engaging with those. And then you've got the usual sort of World Bank, IMF annual meetings as well, which intersect with a lot of those key private sector creditors. Obviously, one of the really big ones that we've got on the horizon this year is the COP30 in Brazil, which really brings together quite a lot of these different threads. So I think that's an opportunity to bring in, you know, where debt and climate intersect. That's probably something that hasn't been brought up in the UNFCCC space enough before, but really has a role there. Obviously, climate finance is always a big topic on the table at those climate talks. And I think, you know, slightly linking to the ISDS work that James mentioned, critical minerals seems to be an increasingly important agenda item that may be featuring in the COP this year as well. And that has impact on the sort of state dispute settlements and those trade agreements as well. Another really big one for that this year is the G20 meeting, which I think this year is chaired by South Africa. And they've identified that one of their big priorities is the sort of just energy transition and critical minerals as well. So again, I think talks around how you fairly use those minerals, how they're fairly benefiting local communities will be something that might come up in those spaces as well. So that's a few just off the top of my head. I think a small plug for IIED as well. There's also the community-based adaptation conference as well, which I'll put a link to in the chat, which is convenes a number of practitioners and organizations working on climate adaptation and particularly local actors as well. And that really links into, you know, the money that's been driven to that place. And it's a sort of forum where we can share best practice and examples of how good quality locally led adaptation can be funded.
Thank you, Oliver. That's great. And I think also a little nod to IIED. We produce a roadmap for the year ahead of each year, which sort of contains a number of key moments and conferences and events in it. I think we published that on our website, but I just want to check with Oliver that it's not only on our internal intranet sites, but if it's of interest to you, please do let us know and we can share that with you.
It's an internal one that we do publish where we're at most of those events that I mentioned, and we have those added to the website. But if you do have any other questions about those, or you know, looking to collaborate with IIED, or you know, what else is on our radar for the year, because that's just a small fraction of the very large roadmap we have, then I'll pop my email into the chat. Feel free to contact me. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. That's great. I think I'm going to wrap up questions there now, unless there's anyone that wishes to put their hand up for anything that's burning on your mind. Can't see any hands. In which case, I will hand back to Francis, please, if I may, to close. And once again, thanks ever so much to all of our panelists, and thanks to all the attendees for your time and attention today. And if there are any future questions, you've got some of our colleagues' contact details in the chat, so please do get in touch, particularly on how to access some of this funding that we have in order to do the research that can lead to the news headlines of the likes that John spoke about, to surface these issues and bring greater scrutiny to them, because they it all helps to sort of unfreeze or unblock some of these blockers. The more eyeballs are on them, we believe. Thank you so much. Over to you, Francis.
No, just thank you all for your commitment and your time. And obviously the people who are here really enjoyed and benefited from it and have said so in the chat. I'm just sorry some of the ones who signed up aren't here, but we will share the recording with them and all the links, all the useful links that you've shared. And, you know, many of our members are working on many of these key issues. I was very pleased for the positivity that Ruth especially say around the financing for development. I am a bit less positive perhaps, but it's great to hear that you're hopeful of some positive outcomes. So that's grand. I was in a feminist discussion this morning that suggested it should be feminist funding for development as the only way to transform it, but we could have that discussion offline. But just to say thank you to everybody for their time and for all their commitment in this space. And there's a lot to do. Annalise Dodds told a few of us a couple of weeks ago that she wouldn't do anything that risked the City of London's finance when she was asked about some of these questions on pushing private sector debt and the ISDS space. So there's a lot that we all need to be doing to get a change in that space. So I'm sure we'll all be working together on that. So thank you. And thank you, IIED, and all your colleagues for your hard work. Okay.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Francis. Thanks. Bye, everybody. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.